Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to talk with you about the produce safety rule that sets forth enforceable standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh produce consumed in the U.S. for the very first time. I'll start out with a very brief background describing our regulatory framework, which considered many factors, including the diversity of operations, the broad range of crops and practices that are associated with producing fresh produce, not only considering what's produced in the U.S., but also taking into account the produce that's produced from multiple countries outside of the U.S. And so we built in an integrated approach that draws in current scientific information, outbreak data that we've come across in developing the rule. And this information informed our approach, which focuses on identified routes of contamination, really practices that go into producing produce rather than commodities. We're not taking a commodity-based approach. Our approach is focused on practices. The information that we evaluated was supported that unsafe practices can lead to unsafe produce, regardless of the commodity type, if consumed fresh or raw. So I'll first go into the scope of the produce safety rule. Of course, we cover domestic and imported produce and produce for human consumption. We don't cover by the produce safety rule produce that is intended for animal feed. We do not cover produce that is not raw, in a raw state, such as produce that's sliced, chopped, cut, diced, that would be subject to the preventive controls regulation. And we also cover we don't cover certain specified produce that is rarely consumed raw, including potatoes, and we did a dietary consumption analysis to determine what those commodities are. Also, farms that are producing less than or earning less than or equal to $25,000 of total produce sales per year are excluded from the rule. Also, we have exemptions associated with produce that is intended for commercial processing with a kill step or a process that adequately minimizes hazards. And so an example of such a commodity would be tomatoes that would be intended for producing tomato paste or tomato sauce. We also have a qualified exemption that I'll talk about here. Farms that are eligible for the qualified exemption would have to have total sales of less than 500,000 annual food sales, and a majority of those food sales would need to go to a qualified end user, which is defined as a consumer of the food or restaurant or retail operation. Considering the diversity of operations that are subject to the rule, we've built in flexibility, including we allow for variances. If a state or foreign country make petition for an FDA variance for some or all of the provisions and necessary in light of local growing conditions, and the practices that would be considered for variances would need to offer the same level of public health protection as the rule and not increase the risk of produce for risk that the produce is adulterated. Very similar, but different in important ways, we've also allowed for alternatives and for the water provision area or certain water requirements within that agricultural water provision area. And in this case, farms can provide supporting information, a study that shows that, again, the practice does indeed offer the same level of public health protection and does not increase the likelihood of adulteration. So I mentioned that the standards focus on routes of contamination or practices, and we cover agricultural water, biological soil amendments, worker health and hygiene, equipment, tools, buildings and sanitation, domesticated and wild animals, and we have sprout requirements as well. I'm not going to cover the sprout requirements in the interest of time, but I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that are out there regarding sprouts. I'll start out with the agricultural water provision area. First of all, I'd like to point out that the only water that is covered by the agricultural water provision area is water that is likely to or intended to contact the harvestable portion of the plant. So any water that is applied through subsurface irrigation, for instance, that is not likely or intended to contact the harvestable portion would not be subject to the requirements in this provision area. In addition, there's a qualitative standard that applies across the board for the water that is covered that requires that the water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality. And there's also requirements that the water distribution system must be inspected at the beginning of the growing season or at least once annually. If there are water treatments being applied, then there are specifications for how that treatment should happen. We've also built in a tiered approach to the water testing. Surface water is subject to higher frequency testing requirements than groundwater because surface water is more variable generally more variable than ground surface water. There's also specific microbial criteria for water used for certain purposes. Our criteria are built around generic E. coli, which is an indicator for fecal contamination. The stringency of the microbial criteria are associated with the risk of use. The water that is used for post-harvest activities is subject to a more stringent criteria than water that's used for growing, simply because the water that is applied post-harvest is more connected with what the consumer will be exposed to upon consumption. We do allow for options for corrective measures if there is an exceedance of the criteria. And one of the corrective measures that we allow for is we allow for a grower to account for die-off that can occur in the field. We allow for a 0.5 day per day die-off between the application of the water and the time that the produce is actually harvested. And there are also record-keeping requirements associated with the agricultural water provision area. Moving on to biological soil amendments of animal origin, we've included standards for treated and untreated biological soil amendments. An example of an untreated biological soil amendment is raw manure. And the restrictions of there are restrictions on the application method depending on the treatment status. So the more stringent the treatment status, the more flexibility that you have with respect to the application method. The use of untreated manure I'd say untreated biological soil amendments such as manure, we dressed in the proposed rule as having a 9-month standard. We've essentially in the final rule deferred action on a minimum time interval between application and harvest, and pending a risk assessment that we're currently working on. It's working with our stakeholders, including USDA, to develop that risk assessment that would inform a new standard, a minimum time interval, based on the information that's provided through the assessment. There are processes for meeting the treated standard for BSAs of animal origin, including the 2 composting examples that we provide for in the rule. It's important to note there are no testing requirements in this provision area, and that the standards that are included are more or less performance standards that have to be met. We have requirements in the worker health and hygiene area in that we have requirements that establish or require that procedures be in place for prevention of contamination by ill people of produce and fresh and food contact surfaces. We have requirements for hygienic practices, including practices involving hand washing, requirements describing how and when to wash hands, and then also requirements for visitors that are visiting farms. We have a section on, again, equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation. The equipment and tools must be designed and constructed to allow for adequate cleaning and maintenance. That same approach applies to buildings, in that the buildings must be of adequate design and construction to facilitate maintenance. We also require that food contact surfaces of equipment and tools be inspected and maintained, cleaned and sanitized as necessary. So we have a catch-all provision area that includes requirements that don't cleanly fit in some of the other provision areas, and the requirements in this provision area involve not distributing covered produce that drops to the ground before harvest. One exception to that is produce that is intended to drop to the ground as part of harvesting, such as nut products. Also, the food packing material that is used must be appropriate for use, must be sanitary, and any produce that is produced along and using the same common equipment as produce that is not covered by the rule and not subject or in which the rule requirements are not being implemented, those produce commodities need to be excluded from one another and separated from one another. We have requirements for domesticated and wild animals where we are requiring that an assessment be done of the field to determine whether or not there's a reasonable probability of animal intrusion. And if there is product that is where there are signs of significant animal intrusion, you need to take steps to prevent that product from being harvested. And so we have compliance dates that I didn't include here in the slide set that are staggered similarly to the preventive controls regulation, where we have the larger farms subject to the rule would be required to implement the rule and 2 years after the effective date. So basically November of 2018, they would be subject to the rule. And then a year after that, the small operations, and then followed by the very small operations. As was mentioned earlier, there's an additional 2 years for complying with the agricultural water requirements on top of those staggered compliance dates.